Good evening, everyone. I'm Andy Miller. I'm a member of Hizikamuna and of the planning team behind this series, Jews of Color, Jewish Institutions, and Jewish Community in the Age of Black Lives Matter. It's my pleasure this evening to welcome you to our virtual program, presented in partnership with the Jewish Museum of Maryland. Tonight's topic is an issue of personal importance to those of us who planned this series last summer, and its importance has only increased in light of the events of this last week, when a violent mob stormed the US Capitol. Many of those in the crowd broadcasted their belief that neither Black lives nor Jewish lives matter. This summer, in response to events we all remember, many Jewish organizations, including synagogues, made public statements saying explicitly that Black lives do matter, because there was abundant evidence that many institutions and individuals in this country continue to act as though they do not matter. This is literally a matter of life and death. Although most of the Jewish community was supportive, we also heard on multiple occasions the argument that Jewish institutions should not support Black Lives Matter because it's a movement that is anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist. And in several public conversations, we saw and heard Jews of color, and in particular Black Jews, being asked to answer this charge. In effect, they were asked by members of their own community to defend a statement that their life matters. We are acutely aware that it is unfair to put Jews of color in the position of having to answer questions that ask them to pit one part of their identity against another in order to satisfy the concerns of those of us who are Jewish and identify as white. Indeed, the reason why this session is included in our Jews of Color series is to acknowledge and to try to address how the history of relations between the Jewish community and communities of color affects our attitudes today, which in turn also impacts those of us who are Jews of color. With that, I would like to introduce our moderator for this evening. Tracy Guy Decker, until recently of the Jewish Museum of Maryland, is a senior partner with Joyous Justice, where she is the co-creator and co-host with April Baskin of the podcast and video series, Jews Talk Racial Justice with April and Tracy. And she is the mind behind BeMoreIncremental.com. This evening, Ms. Guy Decker will be interviewing Dr. Mark Dollinger. Dr. Mark Dollinger holds the Richard and Rhoda Goldman Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies and Social Responsibility at San Francisco State University. He has served as research fellow at Princeton University's Center for the Study of Religion, as well as the Andrew W. Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow and Lecturer in the Humanities at Bryn Mawr College. Professor Dollinger is author of 4 scholarly books in American Jewish history, most recently Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance in the 1960s. Dr. Dollinger is past president of both the Jewish Community High School of the Bay and Brandeis Hillel Day School. Dr. Dollinger serves on the boards of the Jewish Community Federation, the Osher Marin JCC, and URJ Camp Newman. He sits on the California Advisory Committee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights. Tracy, I hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Andy. It's great to be back at the Jewish Museum of Maryland. Mark, welcome back to Baltimore, sort of, kind of.
It's great to be in Baltimore, even if by Zoom.
So for those listening, I will just share that you and I first met a little more than 2 years ago when you were actually physically in Baltimore as a visiting scholar at Baltimore Hebrew Congregation. And I had the great privilege of breaking bread with you over a Shabbat dinner. And it's really great to be with you.
Great to be back. Thank you.
So I'm going to dig right in because we got a lot to talk about. Let's start with your research. So there is a narrative of the relationship between the American Jewish community and the American Black community that many of us have inherited from our ancestors, our grandparents. If I could sum up that narrative with one image, it would be that famous 1965 photo of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. marching arm in arm with Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel across the Pettus Bridge. So many of us have been left with the understanding that that kumbaya relationship deteriorated as a result of the rise of Black power and Black identity politics, sort of pushing Jews away. And in your book, Black Power, Jewish Politics, you really dig into and challenge both parts of that narrative, both the Kumbaya minute and what happened after. Can you start us off by framing your take on that narrative for us?
Yeah, thank you. So academic historians, our job, we call it historiography. That is, we look at all the literature on an historical event that earlier generations of academic historians have written, and we go back to the sources and see if we have a different and hopefully better and more complicated telling. So you described really the first generation of historical scholarship, and I have to say it's true, because American Jews have been the most liberal, progressive voting bloc outside of African Americans, since really 1928. And in many instances in the civil rights movement, the majority of the white activists were Jewish. And it turns out, if that's where we stop our understanding, we're going to miss so much more that actually is going to give us really important insights to understanding the fullness of history. For example, Southern Jews were not as public in their support for civil rights. I mean, that could be one way to say it. Northern Jews, who were often critical of Southern Jews for not being public enough, were actually moving into all-white housing units without recognizing that in their achievement of the American dream, they were actually participating, in systemic racism. In my research, I was surprised to learn that Jewish leaders in the 50s and 60s, mostly middle-aged white men, understood these complexities and the limits between what it is to be white Jewish and what it is to be Black in America. Ultimately, and I think what we're going to talk about tonight, is the fact that historical memory, what we remember or think history was, turns out to be different than what the history actually was.
Yeah, I'm actually going to stay with us for just one more moment to share with our audience, and actually, Trillian or Laura, if you could do the screen share of this quote, which I will read. I'm quoting from Mark's book here, but this is specifically related to Baltimore. You wrote, Baltimore's Jason R. Silverman offered Forster, that was the head of the ADL who requested, the ADL General Counsel, Arnold Forster, who requested memos about the question of Black-Jewish relations. So he offered Forster a 3-year perspective on Black-Jewish relations in his city, that is Baltimore. In 1961, he explained, quote, Negro organizations sought us out to participate in joint meetings, called upon us for educational materials, etc. By 1964, he lamented those requests proved very seldom, leading him to conclude that cooperation between us and Negro action organizations is not as good today as it has been in the past. In this Black militant climate, Silverman needed to take the lead with his African-American colleagues. Quote, the only time I find myself relating to the Negro leadership, he wrote, is when action is initiated from my ends, end quote. When Silverman tried to work with the SCLC, the NAACP, and the Urban League to coordinate positions on a Congress of Racial Equity boycott of DC schools, he revealed, quote, I was politely received, but politely told off, that while they appreciated our cooperation, they would prefer to have Negro organizations working together as Negroes. I wanted to take a minute, and you can stop the screen share now, thank you. Just to share that, for one, because it's a piece of Baltimore history that I understand is actually not available anywhere else. And maybe you could just very briefly talk about your finding those memos.
Yeah. So actually, first, I just love to tell the story behind it. That was a really good day at the archives. This was at the American Jewish Historical Society, now in Lower Manhattan. I came across this document, and it had a stamp on it that said confidential, not for publication, which meant that Forster was sending out this request to all of his branch offices across the country. And I thought, does this mean that I, as a scholar, am not able to publish it or not? And I did a little bit of ethics research on it and discovered I did have permission to publish it. And what it means is, when Silverman wrote that, he had an expectation of privacy. And that's helpful for the scholar to know that we're getting sort of a truer and more honest sense. And what he was noticing between 1961 and 1964 is that what you described as the Kumbaya period was evaporating and Black militancy was rising. And he in the field in Baltimore was on the pulse of that. The larger thesis that Silverman and Baltimore fit into is really all about the fact that this was not a surprise to leaders like Silverman. And as frustrated as some of them may have been that we're not getting the arm in arm stuff, this is really reflecting their understanding of the limits of white Jewish liberalism. And while there can be an alliance in some areas, at a certain point, there needs to be greater Black autonomy, certainly within Black organizations.
Yeah, the thing that really struck me is that the message I got was sort of the inherited message was sort of an animosity, which is not displayed here. It's really about a desire for self-determination, which is different than, we hate you. So anyway, that's just an aside. I know our audience is here to hear about Zionism and anti-Zionism. So I'm going to move us along. The final chapter of your book is entitled Black Power and American Zionism. In it, you compare the nationalist tendencies of American Black activists with those of American Zionists. And interestingly, for me at least, not having lived through it, those comparisons were sometimes very self-conscious and shared by reciprocal admiration, if sometimes grudgingly admiration. And that the grudge part of that sometimes got downright vitriolic. And in your book, you really don't shy away from the cases where Black Power activists criticize the Jewish state, sometimes in language that, is hard to read. And then that chapter about Zionism is followed by your epilogue, where you bring us forward from that time to the present. So I'm going to compare the present now for context, and then I do have a question for you. So a reminder to our audience, a small part of the 2016 policy platform of the Movement for Black Lives took aim at the US and Israel, referring to Israel as an apartheid state and using the word genocide to refer to Israeli treatment of Palestinians. And for context, I will say, I have heard your friend and colleague, Ilana Kaufman, and then her statement was echoed by the president of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, Jonathan Greenblatt, saying that that anti-Israel section was approximately 300 words out of 40,000 in this policy platform. So you noted in your epilogue that those several hundred words elicited super strong statements of condemnation from Jewish groups across the political spectrum. So in the 4 years since that platform was released and those Jewish organizations reacted, I have heard many white Jewish people suggest, as Andy alluded to, that Jews cannot or should not participate in Black Lives Matter activism. These sentiments are particularly likely, in my experience, to come from folks I might call Jews in the pews, that is, ordinary lay people, as opposed to the leaders like Silverman that we just heard from the 60s, or leaders of those organizations that might have issued statements. And it's gotten to the point that, as Andy and I noted offline as we were prepping for tonight, that denouncing anti-Israel or anti-Zionist statements and effectively canceling anyone who has made statements like that has become a sort of litmus test that some white Jews seem to be insisting that allies pass this litmus test before we can give them support of any kind. So I'm going to set aside the complicated relationship between the Movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter, because I don't want to get into that right now, but just in more general terms, I really want to dig into the litmus question and the history of that. So my question for you is, historically, looking back at this time that you studied and through to today, historically, did white Jews have a litmus test like this for the Black folks that they were working with? And regardless of your answer, what do you say to folks who want to use a litmus test now?
All right, thank you. Those are two questions. I really think there's like 25 questions you had worked up in there. So I'll work it back. And if I miss something, just jump in. I want to say first, I'm a scholar of American Jews. I'm specifically a scholar of white Jewish liberalism. So in this book, and even in your questions, I'm less interested in Black Power and Black Lives Matter as I'm interested on how white Jews and white liberal Jews are responding to it. And really what you've done, I think, is just layered. If we want to look at Israel, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism as our focal point, this can unwind so many different important issues that extend well beyond it. Israel was, in the American left, sort of a hero of socialism on a national scale, from Israel's founding in 1948, up until the mid-1960s. And then, as you referenced, in the mid-60s, a lot of the American left turns anti-Israel and anti-Zionist, and sometimes they turn anti-Semitic. And this was really problematic for white Jewish liberal Zionists, who now were united with their social justice colleagues on every issue, until they got to Israel. So in my research, in the first chapter of the book, I actually discovered that white male Jewish organizational leaders were empathetic with the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad, even as he was professing clearly anti-Semitic stuff. So to me, it wasn't about the nation. It was about why on earth these Jewish leaders aren't responding in
Right.
the 50s the way like they did in the late 60s.
They do now, yeah.
Yeah. So that's piece one. Piece two, in the mid 60s, what I found was American Jews discovered they could be more public with their Jewishness, young people, than their parents were in the 50s, right? In the 50s, you get into the white suburbs, you're surrounded by Christians, you're trying to kind of be quiet about being Jewish.
Mhm.
Once the ethnic revival of the mid 60s led by Black Power emerged, Jews were very proud to be Zionist. So the irony is, even as some in the Black Power movement were anti-Israel and anti-Zionist, that is, in my mind, what fueled American Jews to take to the streets in their Zionism. I also talked about Soviet Jews and other movements as well. So we have this strange dialectic where there is going to be a rise in the left of anti-Zionism, yet that's also going to fuel Jewish nationalism for American Jews. For American Jews that made Aliyah, that immigrated to Israel between 1967 and 1980, overwhelming majority were on the political left. Between 1980 and 2000, overwhelmingly on the political right. Sarah Hirschhorn wrote a great book on American Jewish liberals who went to Israel and joined the settler movement, if folks are interested in that. And then to bring us to let me ask a direct question. Was there a litmus test? I want to change gears for a second. Many of us are familiar with Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. We are sometimes less familiar with the fact that it followed a newspaper ad that was taken out by clergy, including the local rabbi, Rabbi Grafman, that told King that they appreciated the goals of the movement, but they didn't appreciate the pace and the publicness and the confrontational approach that even King, right, who is not normally seen as confrontational compared to others, were taking. His letter from a Birmingham jail was a critique of white moderates. Right. And it was a critique by name of rabbis as well. So here we see even Dr. King was subjected to a litmus test for how quickly he wanted to, to move or not to move. To bring it to today, and I'll quote my teacher on this, Ilana Kaufman, what's the point? The point is that Black lives matter. That is the point. It's about racial justice. And if white Jews are or not interested in embracing the notion that Black lives matter, that's the singular question. By introducing litmus tests, whatever they are, what we're actually doing is decentering racial justice and Black lives in order to center what is typically white Jews, or white liberal Jews in my research. That in and of itself is problematic, right? And that is actually reflecting a lot of the larger themes, which we can get into if you want, around white privilege and what happens in a culture of white supremacy.
Right, I think thank you for that. I think that's really well said, that the decentering, that it's a distraction, and it's a form of what I've heard referred to as emotional bypassing. You don't want to think about this thing, so you redirect the conversation. It's very well said. Thank you. So you just use a phrase, white supremacy. Forgive my dog. He's okay. He's really okay. I know that sounds terrible. So some of our listeners with us today might be aware that you actually recently had what turned into a very public disagreement with Brandeis University Press, the publisher of Black Power Jewish Politics, around that phrase, white supremacy. The details are more than we have time for. And folks, it's fascinating. Go check it out. The Forward has multiple articles and open letters from people supporting Mark, open letter from the press responding, op-eds. There's a lot. Look it up. Short version for us tonight is that the press objected. Well, let me back up. Because of what has happened, your book sold through three times?
3 times.
The printing.
3 times.
Mazel tov. And so after the events of the summer of 2020, I understand you were invited to write a new preface for this book for the new printing. And in that new preface, which had been solicited by the press, I would add, you used the phrase white supremacy. In particular, in the new preface, you wrote of the Jewish response to the national reckoning we saw in the summer of 2020, quote, physically distant from the nation's urban centers, suburban Jews lamented their lack of proximity to communities of color and the ways in which the last few generations of American Jewish social mobility have reinforced elements of white supremacy in their own lived experience, end quote. Now, I know when we hear the phrase white supremacy, for many of us, it conjures the KKK or skinheads or the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, although with the events of last week, it's coming a lot closer. I personally refer to those folks as those who are self-described white nationalists as radicalized white supremacists. But white supremacy is infused into American culture. Now, just as an aside, this is me talking. I want to name that white supremacy is not about, it's not just about individuals thinking that non-white people are somehow inferior. White supremacy is a system of oppression. It creates structures that reinforce themselves and the lie that they are somehow natural or normal. And we did see that on full display at the Capitol last week and in the press afterward. For instance, I'm going to lift up a quote that I saw actually tweeted by the magazine The Nation, where an unidentified woman said, "This is not America. They're shooting us. They're supposed to shoot BLM, but they're shooting us, the patriots." That is really telling. That the structure of white supremacy is so reified that this unnamed woman, in her mind, she was experiencing cognitive dissonance when authorities used force to stop white people from overrunning the halls of Congress. So with the urgency of last week's events as our backdrop, let's take a step back and talk about the phrase that you used casually that I've just unpacked a little bit more. What do you mean by it? How do you think that white supremacy affects white American Jewish culture, even though we are targeted by it, by its most extreme manifestations? Those are two questions, maybe more.
Thank you for the questions. And I actually don't want to answer it.
Okay.
I will answer it, but I actually want to work up to it because I actually think that the culture that created that question is itself emblematic of what we're talking about, which is to say that the Forward headline led with the fact that I used the words white supremacy. And I did use them. And when I read the article for the first time and I saw how much of a focus was on a conversation around white supremacy, I was like, oh God, I better go back and see what I said about it, right? Like I literally didn't remember that I used it. I mean, I'm sure I did because they said it in the newspaper. One of my colleagues actually did a word search on it for me. I used it 3 times.
Yep.
A 4th time I talked about the supremacy of whites. I guess I was tired of using white supremacy, you know? Yep. And that's because to me, that's not the most important question. The most important question is who gets to decide what we get to talk about? Because the attempt to censor the new preface was an attempt by a university press to prevent us from talking about what the press didn't want us to talk about. Now, university presses are supposed, and scholars, and those I enjoy the privilege of tenure, right? So we are supposed to be the pushiest when it comes to saying uncomfortable things in public, right? I think the whole system is built so that professors and scholars in university presses do not engage in censorship of controversial ideas. So so my main focus, in my decision to cooperate, when it was leaked, to the press, was to say that we need to talk about uncomfortable things. If a white senior male scholar can have his own reflection on his own book, that sold out 3 times, not be able to speak, then can we imagine what it is for women, what it is for junior scholars, what it is for scholars of color? And in this case, what we had was an anonymous reviewer or reviewers, I actually don't know how many, and I still don't know their names, who intervened, to stop its publication. So why did they lead with white supremacy? Because clearly this was going to get people excited, right? So I went back and read the new preface. The new preface is a reflection of how the last year of racial reckoning reflected themes of the book from the 50s and 60s. And a few times white supremacy worked into paragraphs building to larger points.
Right.
So I want to set that. The second thing, which maybe we can get to later, they actually objected to 2 words. They objected to white supremacy, and they objected to my use of the word erasure to describe Jews of color in historical literature. And the fact that we're talking a lot about the words white supremacy and not erasure of Jews of color is itself a sort of white Jewish centered thing to be doing. So with all of that, just to hand to you if you wanted to pick that up later.
No, that's gorgeous. Yes, that's absolutely, that's gorgeous.
I'll go to the direct question. White supremacy is a system by which white people get to be supreme. White people get VIP status when it comes to education, healthcare, not getting policed, or if you do get policed, not getting the death penalty.
Not getting shot.
Yeah, like in every aspect, right, of American society where there's power interactions, we notice that those who are defined as white are going to enjoy a supremacy which those who aren't will not get, exists. And white Jews, by virtue of being white, and for this, I'm just representing, myself here. I got a different talk on Jews and whiteness because I know that folks even contest that. We as Jews can be victims of anti-Semitism. We are, and sadly, the last 4 years have been the worst in American Jewish history. And we can walk into 7-Eleven and not get followed by police. So not only don't I see a conflict between holding the victim status of white Jews along with the notion that we are benefiting from white supremacy, actually, and I think your reference to the insurrection last week in Washington is the point, it's actually a place where we can come together because Blacks and white Jews, anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism are actually coming in this place from the same spot. So there is an honest place that you can have an interracial alliance because sadly there is a common enemy. I'll pause there. Go wherever you want to go.
No, that's very well put. Thank you. I think I think the point too that one can benefit from that system of oppression and also be targeted by it in different contexts is important to note. But I actually want to follow your lead and come back to the erasure of Jews of color, because after all, our conversation tonight is a part of a series, as Andy mentioned, entitled Jews of Color, Jewish Institutions and Jewish Community in the Age of Black Lives Matter. So as you just mentioned in the contested preface, the thing that you wrote in the preface, for those who are listening, who've attended other sessions in this series, the statement that Jews of color have been erased from almost all of the historical literature in American Jewish history, this book included, hardly seems controversial. And in your epilogue, you note what we've been seeing throughout this series and in other resources centering the voices of Jews of color, especially Black Jews. You wrote, quote, "To view Black Jewish relations through the lens of African-American Jews advances difficult, if not painful, questions about what constitutes Jewishness. You have quotes around the word Jewishness. So let's do it. I'll follow your lead. I want to hear more about you, more from you about how the presence of Jews of color changes the narrative arc that you trace in your work. And my follow-up question to that is, what would you like to see done differently by you and other scholars, and white or white passing members of the Jewish community for that matter, as we move forward? I know that was a lot of questions.
Let me answer your last question first. What do we want to do? Because that's a good place to start. That sentence you read, I wrote that with such intentionality, and I paused a lot. And for me, the most important part was comma, this book included. And that was actually a reference to the epilogue and to the story of the epilogue, because I engaged in writing a book that reflected my own inherent racial bias. And I didn't know it when I was writing it. And I'll tell the story about how I was opened up to what I had just done. And so what do? Well, constant self-reflection, constant learning. And I am a scholar of this, and I publish books on it, and I'm going to tell the story. I am continuing to learn. And I wrote that there because I wanted to announce, right, my own miss on that. And I wanted to sort of model that for scholarship. You know, painfully, and I don't know if it's ironic, one of the bits of feedback I received from the press on the new preface was that they considered it too apologetic, that I had spent too much time, you know, sort of owning my mistakes, and that one, you know, you always want to take critique and understand how you can be a better writer and better communicator from it. And after I thought, you know, a short period on that, I said, no, you can't be too apologetic. If you're an academic historian, in the historiography, our job is to constantly read ours and others' work and figure out what we missed. So here's the story. I finished the manuscript, I sent it in. I didn't have an epilogue. An epilogue is a non-scholarly, you know, like the book ends in 1980, you got to bring it up to the current date. So I didn't want it to be boring, but mostly I was just so darn excited I'd finish the book. It took me years longer. And I figured I'd get a couple months of a break from it before my editor said time for the epilogue. And I was having lunch with Ilana Kaufman. Ilana Kaufman is the founder and president now of the Jews of Color Initiative. And this was the time, it was the 50th anniversary of the Selma March. And the URJ, Union for Reform Judaism, and I am an identified Reform Jew, so I'm about to critique them, it's a self-critique as well, was reenacting the march with the NAACP. And they were going to go to DC and do a voting rights action. And 200 rabbis show up. And Ilana and I are chatting about it, and I'm all nervous because I'm afraid these rabbis are all going to think that they're Rabbi Heschel, and they're all going to come back and they're going to give sermons about how great they are as rabbis and doing it, you know. And Ilana is talking about what it is to, and I share this with her permission because I actually built the epilogue around this story, what it's like to be a Black Jew around the entire thing, right? And it went to the Facebook pictures, right? Because all 200 rabbis put a Facebook picture. And it's the same picture, white rabbi holding a Torah, Black NAACP member. And Ilana said, where am I in that picture? And then she challenged me. She said, you used the phrase Black-Jewish relations. How can it be relations if you're Black and Jewish? It's like, oh, that's a good one, right? How much of the language that I and we as scholars have used assumes Jewish whiteness? Mm-hmm. Then she said to me, you wrote 200 pages on Blacks and Jews and not a single page on a Black Jew. How can you do that? Well, I gave every defensive argument I could, you know, that there weren't that many Black Jews and that wasn't my subject and the rest of it. And she pushed back, right? And she said, go back and reread each of your chapters. Now, my book is all about how much US history matters to Jews, how much the 60s mattered to Jews, how much Black power mattered to Jews, right? That's what I was playing with in the book. She said, how much does the fact that Jews were white matter to Jews? If you reinterpreted history through a lens of racial justice, through a lens of white privilege, how much of the story changes? I'm like, damn, that is right, right? with that one question, she undermined the basic supposition of the book. And I looked at her, I said, that's the epilogue, right? If every generation of academic historian is to look at the previous generation and do a better job, I said, the next story of Blacks and Jews, white Jews and Blacks, I got to work our language here, is going to have to recognize a lens of racial privilege as what we call in history causality, what caused history to happen the way it did. So then to bring it back to the new preface, I wanted to put a bow on that story by acknowledging the fact that even as this book is going to be in its fourth printing, this book already has missed a really important point that is in need for a new book.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that what's coming up for me, what I'm thinking about is that question, going back to actually the title of our talk tonight, the reason that folks signed up to come to talk about anti-Zionism and the response to Black Lives Matter. And as we said, like, how does that, as Andy said in the introduction, how does that argument about that litmus test look when you look at it through the lens of African-American Jews, as you put it in the new preface? Whew, it's big. So folks, we're getting to a point where there will be time for you to ask questions. Please use the Q&A function to send a question to me. If you are watching on Facebook, you can put your question in the comments field on the Facebook Live, and our tech team will make sure that I get it. So I'm just looking to see, there are a few folks have actually put questions in the Q&A. I'm just reviewing quickly. So these are not questions for a historian. So I'm gonna warn you there. So you will take this as you will. Question from Sierra Mezaros. I'm sorry, Sierra. How do we empower each other to take ownership of our role in the perpetuation and exacerbation of white supremacy? That's question one from Sierra. And two is, what do we say to other white Jews that would rather shy away from acknowledging their complicitness?
All right, so first I would like to thank you, Tracy, for acknowledging my historian status. And this happens in most every talk. And I just have to say, for the Union of Academic Historians, I'm not trained in this. And even when we got to the word white supremacy, that's not my academic background. My joke answer to these things is, I'm an historian. It's tough enough to predict the past. It's hard to predict the present or the future. So I've learned a lot as I've gone, and I'm happy to respond to that. First, I want to just acknowledge Sierra and I are co-chairs of the DEI task force at URJ Camp Newman out here in California. So it's great to hear from you. And hold on, I'm looking at the question. I just lost it. I want to bring it back. Actually, Tracy, I think it's probably better for you on how do we empower each other to take ownership of our role in the perpetuation, exasperation of white supremacy, because that is what you do professionally. I'll do the second one first if you want. What do we say to other white Jews that would rather shy away from acknowledging their complicitness? This is basically the question of all the Zoom talks that I'm doing. And what I'm noticing is a lot of the concern among white Jews is a defensiveness, a fragility around the idea that racism, the definition of racism, when I was raised, a racist supported the KKK or wanted Jim Crow, right? And since I didn't, I wasn't a racist. And what we're learning now, of course, is that one has to be an anti-racist. So if Jews, even when they're suffering anti-Semitism, are still enjoying privilege and are part of systems of white supremacy, then actually it's not a personal assault on us as people or as white people or as Jews. It really is an acknowledgement of the way in which the rules of our society have been set up and sort of who benefits from those rules and who doesn't. So I find that when I use that kind of language, it can tend to calm. And then when I move to the different sectors of society in which resources are inadequately distributed based upon race, folks get it, right? Most of my audience understand that that's true. That's the easy part. The hard part, I don't think we're actually at, and that's when the decision points are going to be made about things like education and healthcare, right? And when, you know, sort of white Jewish families are going to be in a moment where they're going to make a decision that they may perceive to be disadvantageous to them because it would be advantageous to another. I don't like that framing, but that's typically how it lands.
Right. So I sometimes will invite people to think about the analog of the patriarchy, which is a lot easier for people to, we've been using that phrase in academia and in just everyday language for a lot longer. And we understand that patriarchy leads to unequal pay and, you know, a lot of other things. It doesn't have to mean a man being mean to a woman, and women can help perpetuate it. We can buy into it and perpetuate it. The first part of the question, thank you for throwing that back to me. How do we empower each other? Sierra, we practice. This is an intentional practice like exercise or meditation or kashrut. And we just have to keep practicing and doing the best that we can until we know better and then do better. And I know that's not satisfying, but that it is ultimately the truth. Okay. Let's see. I'm not sure I understand this question. Neil Rubin is asking about, and this does feel like a historical question, but potentially a historian's question. So that's why I'm going to it. Neil Rubin asks, could you talk about the different, possibly different roles defense organizations, he put that in quotes, play in the Black and Jewish communities and the impact of that on our subject? I'm assuming you mean like ADL in terms of defense. I'm not sure what an NAACP legal defense, that sort of thing.
First of all, I think I know Neil. Neil Rubin might be competent enough, but if you're friends with Brian, good to see you again. I'm going to assume, Neil, that when you're talking about defense organizations, that we're talking about ADL, American Jewish Committee, you know, and others like this. This is a fantastic question, and it's actually, it's central to the Black Power book. Can you talk about the different roles defense organizations play? So let's just take ADL, because I think that's got the clearest the mission, which is fight anti-Semitism. So we should assume that ADL and AJC and others are going to be consistent over time in fighting anti-Semitism. What I found out, you know, in the research was that these organizations in the 50s and early 60s were actually making public statements to American Jews to calm down about the rise of Black militancy and to calm down about spiking anti-Semitism, and that it really isn't a threat. And I found AJC and ADL both coming to the defense of Elijah Muhammad, as I mentioned before. Now, let me give my thesis on that. My belief is that in the 1950s, when we were in the midst of the Cold War and anti-communism was supreme, we really needed to show that a democracy was a place where we could have interfaith and interracial alliances, because we were not internally divided, because if we were, it would look bad to the commies. So if there's going to be a fringe, radical, ideological, militant Black group, the goal is to keep it as marginal as you can. And the tactics of the Jewish defense organizations in the 50s was to put all the focus on Dr. King and none of the focus on then Elijah Muhammad, later Malcolm X, for the purpose of disempowering them, right? 10 years later, in the mid-60s, when Black Power gets ethnic, racial, gender groups across the spectrum to literally take to the streets for themselves, now it's fashionable for Jewish defense organizations to identify now Louis Farrakhan as the enemy of the Jews. Probably 20 years ago, the ADL website had in the lower right-hand corner the 24/7 Louis Farrakhan tracker, right, where you could see where he was and what he was doing. So Farrakhan's anti-Semite. Elijah Muhammad was anti-Semitic. As a scholar of American Jews, I don't care academically, because that's a consistent line. I want to know why Jewish defense organizations in the 50s are taking a completely different response to them than they did by the 1980s, because that tells us something about what's going on with American Jews in society. So I'll leave that there for now.
Okay. I'm seeing this is actually, I'm to remind folks, please use the Q&A if you can, but I am seeing in the chat a question from Rabbi Gus Buchdahl that I don't have any idea about the answer to this. So I'm just going to see if you have a take on it. Rabbi Buchdahl asks, does the racial identity of Arabs impact the response of Jews to Zionism? And does the racial identity of Arabs impact the views of the Black community vis-a-vis Zionism? Recognizing, he says, that the racial identity of Arabs is not monolithic.
All right, so that is such a good and complicated question. And first I'll say, my field is not Israel studies or Mideast studies. I'm looking at American Jews, so I can only view that question through my lens of expertise. And I think I want to probably bring an intersectionality here. That might be a way to look at it, which is to say, well, first of all, we know racial identity is socially constructed. White presenting Jews, we've not always been considered white, prior to World War II. In much of the country, Jews were not. And certainly since the mid 60s, we haven't had intersectionality as a word, that long. There is a notion that communities of color facing oppression based upon race have a link with one another, even across international boundaries. That the commonality of racial discrimination is more important than the differences of whether you're Arab or whether you're American or whether you're anywhere else in the world. And I think certainly now I get this a lot on my college campus. This is where a lot of the solidarity and allyship is coming, and this is where white Jewish leftists and progressives, are facing resistance. Because at once they're advocating on a leftist agenda, and on the other they're now being perceived as racially white and Zionist, which under the other frame is seen as discriminatory.
Great, thank you. So can I just quickly restate that? I'm hearing that the answer is that the racial identity does make a certain amount of difference to the Black community. Vis-a-vis Zionism.
Yeah. So to some, I mean, I want to be careful. To some, right?
And historically, I'm remembering is actually in the chapter about Black power and American Zionism.
Right, and this is where white Jewish progressives, get purged, and this is where the notion of Jews as an oppressed minority in the lead in terms of progressive causes against the idea as Jews as white or Jews as Zionists now come into conflict. And this is a moment of great pain in the mid 60s for a whole lot of Jewish leftists.
Wow, we got a lot. I want to tell you folks that I'm probably going to not be able to get to everybody, but I'm working through them as I can. So this is an interesting question, and this may be for the two of us to work on together. This is from Tema Smith. She asks, one thing I hear regularly is that Jews haven't chosen to be white. And so can we speak to this a bit in light of things like Jews' participation in white flight and other phenomenon?
All right, thank you, Tema. It's good to have you here too. Yeah, Jews, white Jews here, didn't choose to be white. Nobody was born choosing to be whatever it was they were. And I also want to add that since race is socially constructed, it also depends when and where you were born. It's not necessarily just the color of your skin. So can you speak to this in light of things like Jewish participation in white flight and other similar phenomena? So white flight, for those who may not be familiar, in the 1970s especially, when integration efforts came to northern suburban school districts, white parents, who had the money to send their kids to private school, and I wrote in the book about the creation of non-Orthodox community Jewish day schools as a response to the desire by white Jewish parents not to have their kids in public schools around students of color.
Here in Baltimore, there was also a literal movement of people because of blockbusting and redlining, a literal movement from the city center northwest into the suburbs.
Yeah. So Tema, I don't see the connection between the first and the second sentence. If you wanted to add more, but I'll say that in my research, the Jewish parents who pulled their kids didn't argue it was because of racism. They argued it was the quality of education, right? I need my kid to get the best education. They're not going to get it now that Black and brown kids are showing up. So I'm going to send them to a private school. Of course, that moment is where we could say about, Tema's point that they didn't choose to be white, but they were born white, which meant that they had a better chance to have the money to pull the kid, and that they did. And certainly if we look at historical memory, that is our perception of our community as, unqualified support for racial justice, a la King and Heschel, against a whole lot of Jewish day schools that were built in the 70s in order to create racial segregation in public schools in the North. I'll say that communities of color and activists there have been watching that and seeing that and internalizing it from day one. A whole lot of the folks I'm teaching haven't heard that perspective. So a lot of the work that I do is to sort of share that.
Right. So I would direct folks to, on that question in particular, to Eric Goldstein's work. And I interviewed him for this series, and the recording is on the museum's website. But his research is specifically around sort of pursuing and adopting whiteness. His book is called The Price of Whiteness, and Mark references him to a bit. Tema added a little bit. Do you see that? Do you think at certain moments in Jewish history, Jews actively strived? I think that's the verb, to assimilate into whiteness in the US? I think the answer is yes. And I would direct you to Eric Goldstein and his research.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, because it's such a good question, Tema. And here's the thing. I don't think white Jews perceived that that's what they were doing, right? And it's important that they didn't perceive it, because A, it means we're not going to blame them. And B, we're going to show how deep and systemic white supremacy is so that you actually don't have to intend to do it, which is to say the American dream of the Eastern European Ashkenazi immigrant, right? To get their kid to be able to go to college and to be successful in business, and to move out of an apartment in an urban area and have anti-Semitism drop enough and have enough money to get to go to a suburban area and to get your kid into Harvard, right? We can just talk about what we normally see as a great victory speech of American Jewish history, which is all true. And we can also say that that was, as Tema says, actively striving to assimilate into whiteness. And there is a lot of good stuff that comes from it. Power is great, and there's a lot of danger that comes from it too. And I think what the racial reckoning is giving us an opportunity is to start looking at the rest of the story.
Great, thank you. So we only have 4 minutes left, and we are going to end on time. So I'm going to send you this last one from Alan Meyer, because it is exactly in your sweet spot of your history, your historical research. Alan Meyer says, I thought of the refusal of Jewish organizations to condemn anti-Semitic Black Muslim movement in the 60s as an attempt to prevent the larger Afro-American population from having to choose between Jews and more radical Black groups. Do you think that was their motivation, and do you think it was successful?
Okay, so my field is not African-American history, but fortunately I've been able to interact with scholars around the work, and I'll share with you the answers I've had there. No, I don't, because in fact, the Nation of Islam has always been small, and I think actually in the book I did put some data, on how on the surveys they did of Black America around that. It turns out one of my office mates at my last school is an African American sociologist of ethnicity and race, and a former college president of a historically Black college himself in Chicago, and he told me the story that Farrakhan came to campus. And the last thing he wanted to do was welcome Louis Farrakhan, right? Because he couldn't stand the guy. And the thing that bothered him the most was the popularity that he was getting. And he was getting the popularity because he's speaking to the white man, and he's showing Black pride. And, my office mate, was honest enough with me to share that if Jewish newspapers and Jewish media didn't spend so much time glamorizing him and giving him attention, he would be even more marginalized among Blacks. So the irony there is, I think, Ellen, the question gets inverted. And this is where actually, white Jewish fear of anti-Semitism is actually platforming and empowering Black leaders, for whom many others in the Black community are not finding all that appealing, were it not for the white Jewish upset.
We have a lot more to talk about, but no time. Thank you, Mark, so much. I'm going to invite my former colleague, Trillian, to come on and give us some final announcements. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. That was absolutely fascinating. And I think certainly given everyone an awful lot to continue to think about. So I'd like to say thank you to Tracy, to Mark, to Andy for introducing us. I'd like to say thank you to Joy Gale, our captioner this evening. As a note for everyone, as you're heading out the program this evening, you'll be directed to a survey. If you can please take a second to fill that out for us. It really, really helps us in planning our programs. So please take a moment to share your reflections. And now, I'm sure you've noticed, we have referenced a lot of things during this program. And so we are going to fill that chat box with all the links imaginable. So we're going to start up with, there's a couple of the pieces that Tracy referenced early on that you could look into in terms of the responses to Mark's new preface of the book. We're going to drop a couple of those in to get you started. Following that, we're going to, and I will say, we will stay here for a minute so you can grab the links. Following that, we are going to drop in a link to, so you can access the recordings of the past presentations, including that one Tracy referenced. We're also going to drop in there a link to register for our next program, which is January 31st, Raising an Anti-Racist Jewish Child. That's hosted by Jessie Dressin, and she will be working with Imani Chapman. Then we're going to share some links to some of Tracy's current projects. So she referenced, I think earlier, her podcast that she'd recently done. That's going to go in there. Her blog will go in there as well. And also a link to Joyous Justice will go in there for you as well. Sorry, I'm trying to make sure I get these in the right order for you. Up next.
And Mark's things too?
Yeah, that's next. Okay, there's a lot. So up next, we're going to link you to, oh, sorry, Laura, I think I skipped one. Hold on. So next, we're going to drop in a link to Mark's website where you can read his new preface. And then I'm also going to say, if you're interested in purchasing a copy of the book, you can reach out to our gift shop manager, Chris. His email address will pop in there in a minute. If this is a lot of links, also feel free to reach out to me. You can find my email address and everything on the website easily. And then I think the last thing we have to share is the Zoom links. If you want to go and join the book discussion that is going to be moderated by Rabbi Grunberg right now through Hizuk, that will be the last one that we drop in there for you. So hopefully making your life easy to find all of the links you would like. If you can't find something you need, please email me and I will give you whichever of the links you need. And so, yes, I think that's the lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. I want to just lift up a couple of things that in that long list of links, if you only look at two, the new preface is available on Mark's website. It's not published anywhere else. It is worth reading. You will be surprised that it was controversial. And the other thing is that, as Trillian mentioned, I do host a podcast with April Baskin, who is a Jew of color, a Black Jew. And we actually, in the episode that was released today, in fact, we talked about some of the resistance to the phrase Black Lives Matter. We don't go into the anti-Zionism, but we do talk about the ways in which sometimes just using the phrase makes people uncomfortable. So you are invited to have a listen. It really is just me and April having a conversation, totally unscripted. So that's all I got. Mark, thank you. It's always a pleasure. Trillian.
Thank you both so much. Thank
Honored
you.
to be here. Thank you. Stay healthy, everyone.
Have a good evening and hopefully we'll see you all soon. Thank you. Goodbye.